All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our edition of our webinar. Thank you all for joining. I know it's some strange time. Most of you are probably working from home, and either this is some very useful information or just an excuse for you to go and hide in a room and away from the kids. Can have some me time, but either way, hopefully you'll get some benefit out of this webinar. Today we're going to be discussing the LDAP signing requirement by Microsoft, which is essentially something that's becoming a requirement for products as well, and how to actually implement it. So as many of you know who have attended our previous webinars, we try to impart as much education as we can in these webinars. This time, I think we're going to do even more in that we're going to really go through this step by step, so that if you have the technical skills to do this and you feel confident enough, you should be able to use this webinar to actually perform all of this yourself. I would allow something around 8 to 10 hours or so per environment to go through troubleshooting steps and things like that, and give yourself some breathing room. And if you have any questions as you're going through it, you feel free to reach out to us. So Desi's done a few of these, and she's put together this really great deck, which we'll share with you after the webinar. As always, this webinar, along with all the information, will be shared on our website on nogalis.com/education. You can view all our past webinars there in video format, along with the PowerPoint deck and any other materials that we upload. So that should be within about 24 hours. Usually we get it up there, and typically we'll send out a reminder email after this to let you know that it's been posted. So without any further delay, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and then pass this on to Desi to give you some good education on this LDAP signing business. Thank you, Desi.
Hey everyone, good morning. So yes, like Tan said, we will provide this webinar later on our website, but in addition to this, I'm going to write up an article that you'll be able to find on our website that gives even more detailed instructions and screenshots, because I'm going to be throwing a lot of information at you today. So I want you to be able to really understand it. So I'll have an even better documentation in article form for you. Just a disclaimer, as all of you probably understand, there are 4 other people in my house right now, so I apologize in advance for any random noises you may hear. They've all been warned, but we don't always have a lot of control over that.
That goes doubly for me, by the way.
So Microsoft is releasing a patch that is going to enforce LDAP signing. So basically, it enforces signing between communication between LDAP and ADLDS applications and anything that communicates directly with your Active Directory for authentication. So this basically is going to affect all of your Lawson products. The patch that enforces it is going to be released, they said sometime in the second half of the year, so we're thinking maybe summer. As far as I know, we don't have an actual date yet. They already did release a patch in March that does not automatically affect your Lawson environment, so don't worry about that. You can go ahead and apply that patch that they released in March if you haven't already. What that does is it provides a little more auditing tools, and it allows you to enforce LDAPS using group policy, but it doesn't automatically enforce it. So what will be impacted if you don't make these changes? Basically everything. Your LSF environment that uses ADLDS, which is basically all of them for communication, and this is the case even if you have implemented ADFS for authentication, it still is going to impact your ADLDS instance. And then anything using LDAP bind, which again, even if you're using ADFS for authentication. You probably, for Lawson, you have a couple of components that are still using LDAP Bind, and then Landmark also, just even to log into Rich Client, is using LDAP Bind. And then IFS is also impacted because it synchronizes to your Active Directory. So if you don't do this implementation, you're going to see some issues. Your LASI won't start. You won't be able to log into anything using LDAP Bind. IFS won't be able to sync users to Active Directory, that kind of thing. So you definitely want to make sure that you get this done before Microsoft releases the patch that defaults the enforcing. Okay, so what we're going to go over today, there's some prerequisites that I want to go over with you, to just things you need to know and have available before you get started. Then the first thing that you're going to do is install and configure the LDAP certificate for LSF and Landmark. So you need to make sure that you get all the certificate stuff squared away before you actually start on the LDAP Bind configurations. Then we'll talk about updating LSF and updating Landmark. And then there's just a small change in IFS. So the prerequisites, the first thing that you need is an SSL certificate for your AD/LDS server. Most likely that's your Lawson server, but it could be on a different server. So you want to make sure that you have an SSL certificate that has the private key included, and you need to know that private key password, and also has a subject alternate name. This can be an existing certificate as long as it meets the criteria. It can be a wildcard certificate or a server certificate. If it's a server certificate, it needs to be the one that's on that AD/LDS server. And then you need to know your SSO config password for Lawson and the LDAP Bind password. And the LDAP Bind password that you need is, if you look in your install config file on LSF, there is a user name. The entry is called LDAP Bind DN, and that's the password that you need. You need his password. And then you need to know what port you're using for LDAPS. So that's probably your networking team has made that decision. Normally it's going to be either 636, which is the standard SSL, or 3269, which is the global catalog. Global catalog is preferred by Infor, but 636 works just as well. So the first thing that you're going to do is install your new LDAP certificate in the personal store for your AD/LDS service. So first you want to figure out what your AD/LDS service is called. So on the server hosting AD/LDS, you'll look, hopefully in your description, it'll say something about AD/LDS. So you'll open Microsoft Services and look to see what that service is called. And then you'll open a Microsoft Management Console and add the certificate snap-in. And when you're going through that wizard adding the snap-in, you want to make sure that you're adding it for a service account, and then you select that AD/LDS service. And then you're going to import the certificate. And so this is where you're going to need to know your private key password. So you'll import that certificate in to the personal store for that service. And then immediately you're going to turn around and export that certificate as a base 64. And it's one of the options in the export wizard that you want to choose is base 64 encoded x.509. And that has the extension of CER. And you're going to use that file later whenever you're updating your OS and WebSphere Java certificates. After you import the certificate, you're going to need to give permission to the user that's running your AD/LDS service to that certificate. So whenever you go to figure out what that service is called, also make note of what user is running that service. It's typically going to be network service account. So just make note of that user. And then you'll go in and you'll run this command cert util-store my, big M, big Y. And that'll give you the unique container names for all of your certificates that are on that server. And you'll want to go through and make note of the unique container name for any certificate that's related to your LDAPS certificate. So you may have them nested. So you might have a root that you also need to get the unique container name for. And the unique container name is actually a file name. So probably the quickest way to find that file to set the permissions on it is just to search for it, to search your File Explorer. Because the machine keys folder, it can be in different areas based on whatever, different servers have it in different areas. So you can also search for the machine keys or the keys folder. And then what you need to do is you need to set the security on the folder and the unique container file, or files, plural, that you got in the certutil command. And you need to give that user read and execute and read access on that folder, the directory, and the file. And then to just do a quick smoke test to make sure that all the certificate is set up correctly, you on your ADLDS server, you'll run ldp.exe. It's a utility that should be installed on your ADLDS server. So you can just do start and search for it. You'll provide it with the fully qualified domain name of your ADLDS server. You'll give it the SSL port of your LDAP, and then you'll check the SSL box. And then you want to make sure when it pops up that it says it has established a connection and that it's got an entry. If you get an error message here, it will probably be very vague. But if you go to the event viewer, it'll have a more detailed error message. You can probably tell that this happened to me. I got some error messages initially when I was trying to connect here in the event viewer, and Google helped me figure out how to resolve it. So do not go any further. If you get an error message here, this step is critical to making sure that things are connecting correctly. The next thing that you need to do is add your LDAP certificate in WebSphere. This is something that you're going to do both for Landmark and LSF. So you're going to go into your WebSphere instances console for both of those applications, and you're going to update the default trust stores on the cell and the node. And you can add the certificate manually using a file and providing the private key password. But then also a really quick way to do it is to go into the signer certificate and click the retrieve from port button. And what that'll do is it'll pop up the screen on the right that you see here, where you provide the host where the certificate is sitting, the port, this is your LDAPS port, and then you give it an alias. This is just a meaningful name that you'll give it so that you know it's the LDAPS certificate. And then you click the retrieve signer information button. And if it finds your certificate, which it should, all the stuff down on the bottom that's kind of grayish will populate automatically. And then you'll also see that it has a fingerprint that you can compare to the thumbprint on your certificate properties to make sure that it pulled in the right one. And then you just hit OK and save your changes and synchronize your nodes. And again, you're doing this both in Landmark and Lawson for both the cell default trust store and the node default trust store. The next step is going to be adding the LDAP certificates to OS Java and WebSphere Java. There are a couple of ways to do this. There's an iKeyman utility, which is a GUI utility that's delivered with WebSphere. And then there's also a key tool command line utility that you can use. So I have examples for both ways. So this is going to demonstrate how to do the OS Java using iKeyman. So you need to figure out where you have Java installed, and you may have it installed in a couple of places, and go ahead and update the certificate wherever you have Java installed on this is for your Lawson and your Landmark server. So Lawson uses Java, so you need to make sure that you update the one that's being used by Lawson, but also the place where it's being used by Landmark. And then to open up the iKeyman utility, you would go to your WAS home your application server home and bin, and just run the BAT file iKeyman. And when it opens up, you're going to select the key database type of JKS, and then you're going to browse to the CA certs file, which is going to be located at your Java home in JRE, lib, and security, and pull that file in. And I should have mentioned that before you start this, go ahead and back up all your CA certs files. I'm a person who likes to have backups of my backups, so just make sure you've got everything backed up before you get started there. You'll be prompted to enter a password. The default password is always change it, all one word, all lowercase. So if you have somehow changed that password, then hopefully you have it written down somewhere, but it's, anytime I've ever seen it, it's been change it. So the next step is going to be, you'll click the add button. So you're adding a certificate to that CA certs file. And you need to make sure that you're adding it to the signer certificate. So you choose signer certificates in the drop-down list. Click add. It'll give you an opportunity to browse to the CER file that you downloaded at the beginning when we were talking about the certificate. So you grab that CER file. Again, you're going to give it a meaningful name, something that lets you know that it's your LDAPS certificate. I chose to call mine AD root. So once you hit OK and save, that AD root, that new certificate will show up in that list of signer certificates. And okay, sorry about that. My the slideshow cut out on me. Okay. So then it's a similar process, adding WebSphere Java. Again, you're going to want to figure out where Java is installed for WebSphere. So it's typically going to be in your WebSphere install directory, and you're going to, most likely you're going to have just a Java folder, and then you're going to have a folder for each version. So you might have a folder for Java 1.7. You might also have a folder for Java 1.8. So all of those are going to have CA certs files in them, and you're going to want to update all of them. And it's the same path once you get into the Java file. It's the JRE directory, lib, and security. Again, back up your CA certs files, all of them, and then you're going to go through these steps for each one that you have. The first thing that I like to do is use the key tool. This is just a command line utility. So you just open up a command line in administrator mode and run this utility. And the first thing I like to do is list out what is in the CA certs file into a before, quote, before file. And that way I can kind of see, I can compare what it looks like before, and then I list it out again at the end so that I can make sure that the certificate was actually added. So that's my first step. And then you use the key tool to actually do the import. So you can see the command here. Again, the password should be change it. And then the last thing again is to list it in an after file, and then that way you can compare the two files. So this is just a busy example of running those commands, and then you see once you list it out, it'll show that the certificate was added. You'll be able to see it. You won't see it in your before, and you will see it in your after. So you need to do the LDAPS configuration next. So this is something that only needs to be done on LSF. This isn't actually the LDAP bind. This is updating the authentication data store settings. So this is done in SSO config. That's another reason that you need to know your SSO config password. Right now in version 10.09, it's option 3 in SSO config. And the only thing you need to change is the provider URL, but you also have to provide the password. So the provider URL, you're going to hear me say this a lot, you're going to change the protocol and the port. So the protocol is going to change to LDAPS, and the port is going to change to your LDAPS port. And then the next two values can just stay the same, so you can just hit enter, but then you need to enter the password again. So that's where you need to know that LDAP bind password. So go ahead and enter that and confirm it. And then again, the last item can stay the same, so just hit enter. And then to smoke test this, you can do an ls-config -l, and it should list out a bunch of data from ls-config. If it doesn't, then if you get an error message, then you need to start troubleshooting that and resolve that error message before you move on. And then updating LDAP bind for LSF, and then again for Landmark. So this is something that's going to be done on both LSF and Landmark. It's a different process for both, but the LDAP bind will have to be updated on both. Again, for LSF, you're going to go into SSO config. Go ahead and export the LDAP bind service that you have. So hopefully you know the name of that LDAP bind service. If not, you can export all your services and figure out which one does the LDAP bind that way. So whenever you export a service, SSO config is very nice. It exports it in a format that's ready to just re-import. So the only thing you have to do is set override equal to true. So there's an element in there at the very beginning that says override equals false as for default. So you just want to change that to true. And then on the provider element, again, you need to update the protocol and port. So protocol is going to be LDAPS, and port is going to be whatever port you're using for LDAPS. And then you can use, once you update that XML file that you exported, you can use SSO config-L to re-import that, that value. So SSO config-L requires the SSO config password and the file, the full file path to the file that you're uploading. And then you can go ahead and do a smoke test in Lawson. So the smoke tests that I like to run, I like to open up the SSO config info servlet. First of all, if there's something wrong with your services, then that won't even load. So that's a first test is to make sure that it loads. And then the second test is just to kind of look through it and make sure everything looks correct. And then the SSO servlet is an authentication test. And because this LDAP signing is impacting strictly authentication, your main goal is to make sure that you can still log into things. So the SSO servlet is a good way to make sure that authentication is working. And then if I make any changes in Lawson, I like to log into Lawson, do a couple inquiries, run a couple batch jobs, that kind of thing. And then you need to update the LDAP bind service for Landmark. It's a similar concept, but a different process. So you'll open up Rich Client and go to your Gen data area. You'll find your LDAP bind login scheme. So you can search for login schemes and then find out which one is doing your LDAP bind. You may have a couple of them, so make sure you update them all. You'll go to the LDAP bind properties tab, and big surprise, you're going to update the protocol and port. So protocol is LDAPS, port is your LDAPS port. And then you can restart the Landmark server, and your smoke test here is just to log into Rich Client, make sure LDAP bind still works. But I also, in addition to this, because a lot of times we'll have IPA processes that try to communicate to Lawson using authentication. So I also like to do some IPA smoke tests. So I'll make sure that web run is still working. I'll make sure that system commands, file access, Lawson queries, that kind of anything that has to communicate with the Lawson server. I try to make sure all those are still working. And just as a side note, I actually have an IPA process that I developed that actually does all of these tests for me so that I can just make sure all my connections are working. And I recommend that everybody develop a process like that. It's super quick and easy. And then the last thing is configuring IFS so that it'll sync your users. So you probably have a bootstrap that you're not actually going to make any changes to, but you might also have an IFS parameter that points to your Active Directory for synchronizing users. That will have to change. And here's where it's different than what we've been talking about. The protocol is not going to be LDAPS. It's still going to be LDAP. And in fact, if you try to change it to LDAPS, you're going to get an error message. It's not going to allow you to do that. So it's a little bit different here. So just keep that in mind. You are going to use your LDAPS port, but the protocol is going to be just LDAP. And then that's your final change. You go into IFS configure and parameters, make that change, and then that's it. You're set. So let me go see what questions we have.
Well, sounds like a piece of cake, Desi. There's a lot of steps.
Yeah,
it's actually my time seeing all the steps also. I'm sure many of the attendees. So, one of the questions that came through was, is this going to be recorded? How can I get a copy of the recorded webinar? Absolutely, yes. We did expect you guys to remember everything that Desi just said. This is being recorded. It'll be hosted on our site shortly, within the next 24 hours, and we'll send you an email with a link and the slide deck. Fear not. The second question we had was Clay saying use Unix. So once you update signers certs in WebSphere, it will update the Java CA cert. We have never performed manual updates to the WAS Java cert file. I guess that was more of a comment. Thanks for that, Clay. And then sorry about those little dings that are coming up. I don't really want to mute the mic because I want to hear Desi. So Martin says, can we make these changes before the Microsoft patch is released? I believe the answer is you should make these changes, but I'll let Desi answer that.
Yes, you absolutely can make them before the patch is released. And like Tan said, you should make them before it's released.
And then Daryl's asking, are there changes that need to be made to external ESS portal servers or the LDI 10.4 servers?
No, anything. So this is only impacting things that communicate with ADLDS. So that's Lawson and Landmark. So anything that uses Lawson for authentication, that authenticates through Lawson, like your DSP applications like LBI, external ESS, those are not going to be, you won't have to make any configuration changes on those servers. You'll just want to make sure that you can still authenticate when you go to those sites.
Okay, Vipul is asking, do you need to have a cert with IP address? I think you have to have a cert. Oh, I see. I think he's saying if you're using an IP address for your LDAP service. I don't know how to answer that.
Yeah, I'm going to write that down and try to do some research on that.
Okay. And then Martin, can we defer applying the Microsoft release if we haven't made these changes when the patch comes out? A lot of clients have asked this very question. Here's the problem that our clients have noticed, and Desi, you can add some color to this, but what I heard from a lot of clients is this is not going to be a single patch on its own. It's going to be a cumulative patch, I believe. So, and it may be difficult for your IS staff to figure out which patch to prevent from releasing. Okay. Now, I'm not 100% sure about that, but that's what the research that our clients have done, not so much us. And then the other thing is, there is this patch is going to hit your Windows machines that are your client PCs. They're going to hit all your servers, and so it'll be kind of difficult for you to kind of determine where it's going to get applied and where it won't get applied. I don't know if you have any more to add to that, Desi, but I think the decision that most clients have come to that had that question is that they're better off applying this patch before. Applying LDAP signing before the patch comes out.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely going to be safer. And you might get some pushback too from your networking folks about not installing that patch. It's a security patch, so they're going to want to install it.
And then there's two ways questions are coming in. One's coming through the chat, the other one's coming through the questions feature. So sorry about if I'm missing your question, I'll try to get to it. Don't worry. So Clay's asking, what about IBM TDS clients? I'm sure we don't know the answer to that, but we can. I'll do some research with our IBM folks here and get back to you on that, Clay. I'm going to write that down. Give me 1 second. Clay. Okay, and how does this apply to single tenant clients? That's Chuck. Now, Chuck, there's obviously, I'm assuming you're talking about single tenant cloud clients, in which case, if you're a cloud customer, my assumption is that Infor is going to apply LDAP signing before the patch is applied to those servers. But if you're talking about a single tenant, meaning on-prem, then obviously it applies. But it does apply to everybody, right? So LDAP signing it applies to anybody, whether or not you're in the cloud or you're on-prem. It's just that if you're in the Infor cloud, Infor is likely taking care of this before it becomes a problem. And then I'm going to read this question here. We tried working on all the steps, but we tried starting the service, and Lawson Insight service was not coming up. Desi, you can probably talk about this, but the instructions that you originally found, the reason we had this webinar, the reason I requested that Desi put this together was the instructions that were out there were not complete, and I think you told me like the first step of those instructions was incorrect or something like that. So I encourage you to follow Desi's directions once we post them and go through that step by step. But obviously, and as Desi said, we are a fanatic about backups. So before you start anything, you want to make sure you've got full backups of all your servers, of your databases, and all that stuff. That we do no matter what the update is. So hopefully you've got a way to restore and start with that, because this type of problem, once it occurs, can be difficult to fix, and a restore can just take minutes usually. But Desi, do you have any advice for? I'm going to butcher your name, Hemant, I believe. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, I just the thing that I ran into was Infor's instructions said only to give the network service account access to the unique container on the certificate. And I actually had to give it to that one level up, that machine keys directory. That was one issue that I ran into, and that maybe that could be what's causing your issue. I would definitely make sure that you can connect using that LDP tool. Make sure you're doing your smoke tests along the way so that you can see actually where it's failing. And then, just start Googling and checking logs. Event viewer logs can typically be very helpful if the system logs aren't helping you.
And then finally, we have a question from Vipul saying, is there a Java requirement like 1.8, or did you notice that there was any requirements for Java version?
No, you just want to make sure you update all your Java certs. There's no Java versioning requirement. There's no versioning requirements really in this at all.
Okay, great. And you guys, if you're on this call and this was a little too technical for you, and you have other questions that are more fundamental, you feel free to email myself or Desi, and our emails are very simple: tan@nogalis.com and desi@nogalis.com. We'll be happy to answer for you. If you decide you don't want to do this yourself, you want to have somebody do it, you feel free to reach out. This is not a very big project. We can knock this out for you in less than about a day, I think. So it's not a it's not a huge expense, and we'd love to work with new customers. And if you get stuck in the middle and you need some advice, we're more than happy to help with that as well. And I'm sure Desi will respond to your emails if you reach out to her. So again, this will be available. I'll try to make it available by tomorrow on our site, and we'll send you guys all an email. hopefully this was helpful to you, and we appreciate you guys attending this webinar. I know that you're working. Hopefully, you're working from home. You're staying safe, and you're enjoying the time with your families. And we're here for you in whatever capacity that we can help. And hopefully, we'll work on some more educational content while we're all under lockdown here, so that we can be somewhat productive. If you have any feedback or you want other webinars, there's something that you want us to cover, there's a feature on our site. If you go to nogalis.com/education, you can request webinars, or if you can't find that, just go ahead and email it to us, or you can use the contact us form on our site. We'd love to hear back from you. Any sort of feedback would be great. And again, we really appreciate you joining us. And thank you, Desi, for putting all this together. That was really great. So much detail and such, well documented. So that sets a new bar for us, I think. I appreciate that.
Awesome. Yes, thank you everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. Awesome. Lots of good feedback already. So yes, I appreciate it, guys.
All right. Have a great day, guys. I'm going to stop the webinar here.